Right, welcome to another edition of the Old Paratrooper Podcast, a podcast where we talk to a wide variety of guests from all walks of life with fascinating stories. If you haven't already subscribed on whatever platform you go to, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and give the Instagram a follow. Without further ado, I introduce today's guest, former Scots Guards officer, Falklands and Gulf War veteran, founder of Sandline International and Aegis Defence Services, my old boss, retired Lieutenant Colonel Tim Spicer OBE. Hi Tim, how you doing?
Very well, thanks.
Good stuff. Thank you very much for taking the time to come on. I always appreciate it when people make time for the podcast, so thank you.
No problem.
Awesome stuff. What I like to do with the podcast, as I mentioned off air, is start at the beginning, kind of where you grew up, and ultimately what led you down the path that you took in life. So yeah, over to you.
Okay, I'll give you a potted history. I was probably destined to join the army because I was born in Aldershot, home of your famous regiment, in a military hospital. So I think really I started early. I went to school in Sherborne in Dorset, left school. Then I dabbled with the law for a bit. I was going to be a lawyer, which was utterly boring. But actually quite useful later in life because I understood things like contracts. And when it came to wrestling with the intricacies of contracts with the US government, it did help. Then from there, what did I do next? Well, I joined the TA for a bit, tiny bit, and then went to Sandhurst. I was lucky enough to get the Sword of Honour, commissioned into the Scots Guards. And then I spent 20 years in the Scots Guards, going from the usual run of platoon commander up to commanding officer. Ended up commanding my battalion. And incidentally, for your parachute regiment listeners, I ended up simultaneously commanding a parachute battalion. Now you may think, how on earth did you do that? It wasn't quite like that. I had 3 companies of paratroopers under my command, much to their commanding officer's irritation, I have to add. A crap hat commanding 3 companies of paratroopers. But it was good fun, and we had a great time. And actually, one of my proudest possessions is, although it sits in my downstairs loo, is a glass case with a background of old-style DPM camouflage, a red beret folded up, and the DZ flashes, because I think it was 2 and 3 para they were mixed companies. And it says on the bottom, "In case of war, break glass and put on head."
I like it.
My relationship with the parachute regiment has been extremely good. Many friends. Left the army, worked for a bit in the city, which again I found a little bit tedious, but again useful experience for doing business later on. I left there. I joined an organization that became Sandline. I wasn't really the founder of it, but I suppose I was the chief executive. And the 2 notable events from that were trying to assist the government and defence force of Papua New Guinea to put down a sort of 8-year-old rebellion, which ended not well because the commander of the defence force decided he didn't really like us, and we had a bit of trouble with him, caused a bit of ruckus. I spent a bit of time incarcerated. There was a big inquiry, but eventually, I was extracted by the High Commissioner, and that closed down. And then the next event was probably more well known to your listeners, the Arms to Africa business, where we were trying to help the government of Sierra Leone before the British intervention. But I think again the Parachute Regiment, the Special Air Service, and others went there to put down the rebellion by the Revolutionary United Front. Well, we were there before, trying to train up people to fight the RUF. And it became known as the Arms to Africa affair because I think there was a muddle in government. The High Commissioner knew all about it, was on side, and we were working with the President Kaba, the democratically elected head of state. But somewhere in the mix, the Foreign Secretary decided that we had contravened the UN arms embargo, etc., etc. A couple of weeks, tricky sort of interviews with customs and things, but in the end, it all worked out, and it was proved that we hadn't contravened an arms embargo, and the rest, as they say, is history. I then left that particular organisation and founded Aegis with 3 other business partners. We started our business really doing anti-piracy, and actually it was just after the incident with the USS Cole in Yemen, and we were invited to assess the Yemeni government's ability to control small boats, i.e. stopping what became AQ from filling them with explosives and ramming them into ships. And from that, well, that happened just before 9/11, and 9/11 happened, and then subsequent to that was the operations, the American operation in Afghanistan, and then the operations in Iraq. And we were lucky to be in the right place at the right time. I went to Baghdad very early on and found a capability gap in the protection of coalition bases, senior personnel, and the protection of the reconstruction effort. And you will know yourself the sort of things that we got up to. And it went from an initial contract to a point where the US government liked us, other governments liked us, the Italian government liked us, and we ended up with 8,000 people on the ground. And I suspect that many of the people listening or watching your podcast may well have worked for us at some stage, including yourself.
Absolutely. We'll come on to Aegis in a minute, but I wanted to talk to you about your kind of involvement in the Falklands briefly. Again, not everyone's really kind of open to talk about it, but hopefully you will share a little bit with us. Was you a platoon commander when you went to the Falklands? Is that right?
No, I was the ops officer.
Oh, you was the ops officer. So what was your involvement in the Falklands, and how did that kind of come about for your unit and stuff?
Well, it was a bit of a surprise, if I'm honest, because we were sitting in London, the 2nd Battalion Scots Guards. I was the ops training officer. And I remember it well because I think the Argentinians invaded probably on a Friday or sort of over the weekend. But I was the captain of the Tower of London Guard, so about as far removed from military operations as you can get. And the sergeant who was, or colour sergeant who was with me, rang me up and said, "Are you watching the TV?" And I said, "Well, I am actually." He said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Not a chance. Not a chance." I get back to barracks the next morning, Saturday morning, and rather unusually, I'm met off the coach by somebody from Battalion headquarters saying, "Commanding officer wants to see you right now." And so I went to see him, and he said, "Look, there is a vague chance we may get involved in this. You want to make sure that all our SOPs and all sort of switch from training to ops pretty quickly. Go away and think about it." Within a week or so, we, the commanding officer, myself, I think the second in command, went to Aldershot to meet the brigade commander of what was then 5 Brigade. I don't think it was called 5 Airborne Brigade, but it was what has become the 16 Air Assault Brigade. But at the time, it was a sort of mix of airborne and Gurkhas and all sorts of people. And at that point, 2 and 3 Para had been dispatched. I think they were already en route, and were under command of 3 Commando Brigade. So we were backfilling, if you like, as I said before, much to our surprise, these 2 battalions, us and the Welsh Guards. And that really started our relationship with 5 Brigade and our involvement in the Falklands. It was a mad scramble. You can imagine that, sitting in Chelsea Barracks, you're not exactly tuned up for combat operation. We went through everything. Many of your subscribers or listeners or whatever will understand getting everything, the basic kit. We had no rucksacks. We had, for those of you who can remember, the 58 pattern webbing with large packs utterly disgraceful stuff, not an act of war.
I think it was a bit before my time, that stuff, but I have heard the stories about it. Yeah.
I forget how old I am, but and also, actually, funny enough, my son reminded me the other day that the Falklands is history. I remember it extremely well, but people of a younger generation, including yourself, it's sort of historical. And actually, I get invited to come and give military history talks about the Falklands, and I still think everybody knows about it. But that's by the by. So we had this scramble to get ready. We did a lot of training. Luckily, we had, because of the public duties commitment, we had just concentrated on what was achievable, i.e. we were fit and we could shoot. And actually, if you've got that sorted out, the rest is relatively easy if you get a bit of time to prepare and reintegrate people into tactical thinking. So there was a massive amount of equipment arrived. We've said, we need cold weather clothing. We need all the stuff that the Marines have got, basically. We then went on a training exercise in Sennybridge, the whole of the Sennybridge area, including the impact area. We exercised over, which was extremely useful, actually. And I remember quoting to somebody, there's a quote from the Duke of Wellington that says the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. Well, the Falkland campaign was won at Brecon and Sennybridge. And you will know what I'm talking about, because it's a very good grounding for military operations.
I've got a lot of names for them sort of training areas, but probably not so polite about them. But yeah.
Well, we've all been there. And we all know those sort of names. But then we, in very quick order, we went down to Southampton, I think it was, or maybe Portsmouth, got on the QE2, quite a luxurious way of going to war, sailed to the Falklands, fairly uneventful, lots of training, as you can imagine. And we arrived, a decision was taken that they didn't really want to risk the QE2 being sunk. That would be too much of a sort of, apart from 5,000 troops being on it, it would have been a bit of a nonsense. And a propaganda victory for the Argentinians. So we went to South Georgia, switched to the Canberra, which had already landed the Marines in the Parachute Regiment. We then went ashore. We messed about getting used to not being able to dig in properly because the water table was too high. We messed about for a bit. And eventually we ended up with the final sort of divisional plan, if you like, the two brigades, Commander Brigade and Fire Brigade, closing in on Stanley. We planned and executed the attack on Mount Tumbledown, which was a real sort of proper infantry fight. People from the Second World War would have recognised it in the same way that Goose Green and Wireless Ridge and others were the same. It was a sort of clearing trenches and bayonets and grenades and all that sort of stuff. And that was it, really. So my involvement was planning the operation, planning the detail of the attack, sort of taking part in the O group, and then running TAC headquarters, which we attacked in a rather unusual way, with three companies in echelon, one behind the other. And the first one took because we were attacking down a narrow ridge, and it was impossible to deploy in a sort of classic 2-up or whatever. So one company attacked its objective. We passed the next company through and the next company through. Quite tricky at night in broken terrain, and the TAC headquarters was up behind each of the attacking companies. And we made it eventually. It was a few sticky moments, helped out largely by naval gunfire support, which we brought in very, very close to the attacking companies. And that was it. And then the Argentinians put their hands up.
Well, I talk. You're right in what you say about it being history. I was 2 when the Falklands kicked off. Not to try and make you feel old at all, but it is, and that was kind of one of the reasons for me joining the Parachute Regiment. Sort of looking, at the past, and I've said it before. We all have generations that we kind of look back on, and kind of for my generation, it was looking back on the Falklands veterans and what they did there, and then obviously now people that are joining will look back on the Afghanistan veterans and the Iraq veterans and what they did there. So yeah, obviously the Falklands, you came back from there, and then you obviously had an amount of time in your battalion and moving around and whatever you did, and then you went to the Gulf War, didn't you? The first Gulf War, is that right?
Not quite. Well, I was involved in it, but I worked in the sort of joint headquarters in High Wycombe, in the big underground bunker, in something called the Joint Planning Group. And really, what it was quite sensitive stuff. We had to deal with all the what ifs. There was a sailor, an airman, and me, and we were the place where you put a problem that nobody could solve, and it had its moments. And I then deployed, actually, after the end of the fighting. I deployed to Dhahran, I think, in Saudi Arabia, and I went up to Kuwait City, but it was over by then. So I was sort of involved, but not directly.
I mean, look, you had a kind of very, very kind of good career in the military, 20 years. What was the decision to kind of, because when you reached the rank of lieutenant colonel, correct me if I'm wrong, obviously 20 years, it would have meant, you progressing and going further up the ranks and doing longer, as a lot of officers tend to do. What was the decision for you did you see an opening with the kind of mercenary stuff, or was it something different that made you leave?
I ended up commanding my battalion, which we talked about earlier on. And actually, we had quite an eventful tour in Belfast. We were there at the start of what became the Good Friday Agreement, but we still had quite a lot of incidents. One guardsman killed, and I think about 50 injured, and quite a sort of rip-roaring tour. And once you've done that and you've commanded soldiers and operations, the path ahead, I could see, was going to be quite dull. Don't put too fine a point on it. And I really had the operational bug, and I decided that I might have to mark time as a lieutenant colonel, or maybe get to full colonel. I didn't really see myself as going right to the top. But I decided to leave, and I was offered a job in the city, quite highly well paid, which sounded interesting and was a complete change. And of course, the moment I accepted the job and told the army I was leaving, I got a telephone call from General Michael Rose, who was commanding the UN Protection Force in Bosnia, saying, basically, get your ass out here now. I need you to come and work for me. And I said, well, I'm terribly sorry, General. I've left. I'm gone. He said, oh, don't worry about that. You square the person you're going to work for, happily was an ex-Scots Guardsman, and I'll square the military secretary. So I got a sort of extension of 4 months and went to Bosnia and worked for the general, which was very interesting. Almost made me change my mind.
Almost.
But in the end, I decided to leave, and I left, and I went to work in the city, which I mentioned to you earlier on. Again, that was pretty dull, lucrative but dull. And then I got an opportunity to go and join an outfit, which was, people use the word mercenary. I don't particularly like it because it's pejorative. Technically it's correct if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, but it has a sort of difficult connotation. Sort of mercenary is bad. So we really coined the phrase private security contractors, private security companies, private military companies, whatever the current terminology is. And I think we were quite vocal about that. And then I mentioned earlier on Papua New Guinea and Sierra Leone. And that was a sort of gestation period, which enabled me to come up with the idea of Aegis as being something that governments needed, because you will recall that in this era, there was what was termed as the peace dividend. The Cold War was over. The size of the British Army was collapsing because the government wanted to spend the money on other things. And I saw a gap whereby if the British Army was to deploy again in the future, which it has continuously ever since that era, nobody really foresaw Iraq and Afghanistan coming. But there would be a requirement for people to support the military, i.e. contractors, which are now a sort of normal form of events on the battlefield. But in those days it wasn't. It was considered very unusual. But I thought that in time, and just to put it very simply, if you deploy a battalion overseas, you want that battalion to do soldiers' business, i.e. fighting, or whatever its mission is. What you don't really want to do as a government is commit a second battalion to look after the first one. And then when the first one's gone, they've gone on leave, you're training up another one, and you're in you get pulled into let's say, for example, a 1 battalion commitment that ends up being 5 battalions. So the niche that we were looking at was doing the protective security to enable the military, the green military, or the black military even, to get on with their job and not worry about securing their bases or securing lines of communication or providing close protection details for senior officers or guarding headquarters, etc. And really, that's what we did in Iraq. And the Americans got it very quickly. They understood it. And that's why we ended up with a lot of people deployed on the ground, which it freed up soldiers to do their job.
Yeah, because obviously pre the Second Gulf War, 2003, there was obviously the mercenary PMC companies, whatever the term, were about, but it was very lucrative. It was difficult for kind of people to kind of infiltrate. It was usually made up of a lot of SF, and it was a lot of African based, as we talked about. And then obviously 2003, the Iraq War kicked off, and it kind of opened up the market, didn't it, for the PMCs, the private security companies, and everything else. And obviously, you kind of set up Aegis. I worked for 2 years for Aegis, and I have a lot of time for Aegis purely, and I'd like to get your kind of, if this was your kind of vision with it, because a lot of the security companies out there, I worked for 3 good companies, Aegis being the best one I worked for, but because it had an organisation, it had a training element, it had a uniform, you got a lot of range time, it had good sort of packages with it and support packages. Was that the vision behind it, to make it a proper professional? Because it was almost like an extension of the military, where some of the others, you felt like a bit of a cowboy cutting around in a pair of jeans, whereas you had more of a uniformality about it around Aegis. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that was the intention. I thought we'd be very much open to criticism, which are like quite a lot of companies that started in Iraq were, that if you look like cowboys, you behave like cowboys. If your management don't care about the boys on the ground and are really just counting the money, that is not going to work. So it was a very simple way of looking at it. I said, well, this needs to be like a unit in the British Army. It needs to have a uniform that you're allowed to wear. Obviously, you can't wear camouflage because of the differentiation between you and the soldiers. But it has to have a bit of an ethos to it. You work for us. This is a good organization. This is what you look like. We won't accept sloppy standards. Your skills have got to be good, but we'll, of course, train you and equip you. In the case of contractors, pay you properly, insure you. And in that, we were lucky in that we were working for the American government, because our terms and conditions were that we were entitled to everything from casevac from the point of injury to long-term recovery. We negotiated with the Americans that we would have the same as US military personnel. And you may recall incidents where people were hurt and casevaced by Black Hawk helicopters, and they were in Landstuhl military hospital near Frankfurt within about 8 hours once they've been stabilized. So we were very lucky from that point that we had that backup. It's a sort of system. If you have to pay for it yourself and you're a cowboy company, you won't do it, and therefore it puts former soldiers, people who I would consider my employees, who I'm responsible for, in a dangerous position, because they're doing something dangerous. They could be shot, they could be wounded, they could be killed. And if you're going to invite people to do that, you have to give them the confidence they're going to be looked after. And that was really the sort of ethos behind Aegis.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a lot of companies out there, and I have a few friends that were injured in ambushes and in IEDs and were left to rot in kind of prison, in hospitals without no support for a number of months before the US government stepped in because the companies just disappeared because they didn't want to pay the insurances. But with Aegis, I remember having to call, being on the Colonel's close protection team was the last contract I was on after Tourist, which I'll cover with you in a minute, and having Apaches come up above us when we were in standoffs with some of the Iraqi kind of forces and stuff like that. You know, when he started to hand the power back to the kind of Iraqi government, and there was a lot of tense moments and stuff. But obviously, you had two kind of big contracts. Matrix contract, which was a massive contract that I was on a bit later on. But when I first went out with Aegis, I stupidly volunteered for Tourist. Now, you may remember, this is where I met you briefly when I was on Tourist. I knew nothing about it, and I thought, oh, this sounds exciting. Now, can you explain Tourist? Because I've told this story before, and I'm sure people don't believe me about Tourist and how crazy it was.
You're going to have to remind me what it was, because it's quite a long time ago.
So Tourist was
keywords.
The Tourist was the one with the filming with the 3 Land Cruisers with the camera on the top.
Ah, okay. It was designed to provide the protection for some new equipment, which at the time was highly classified. And it was a sort of measure of trust that the US government had in us, that we were given this contract, which was a classified contract, and it had to be run by people who had American clearances, sort of secret clearances. And the idea was to really to sort of film. I mean, it's quite hard to describe simply. It was to film. It was to try and create what Google Earth. That you can go on and you can look at a street from all different angles.
Yeah, Street View. Yeah,
Street View, exactly. It was designed to create a version of that to enable people to have it on the screens in the vehicles, rather like Blue Force Tracker. Does that ring any bells with you? Which I think is now sort of standard. You can see where all your friendly force units are and who's around to help you. But it would also enable you to identify in those rather complicated urban environments in Iraq, firing points, escape routes, etc., etc. I think it was a very ambitious project, and I'm not sure that it came to fruition. I think it was just too difficult. But that's how it came about. So you as a Brit, you were quite lucky to be on it, I think.
Yeah, there was a mix. There was a few kind of Americans on it, and the team leader was Australian. And we kind of lived separately away from the contract, but we were out 8 hours a day filming, traveling around every road and street and MSR in the Iraqi sort of Baghdad area at 30 mile an hour filming. And as everyone knows that's been out in Iraq, the most dangerous place you could be is on the road. So I'd say it was, for the 7 or 8 months I was on it, was very interesting. There was quite a number of incidents, and then I think it got closed down in the Baghdad area and then went north to the kind of Mosul area.
It worked better in Mosul, I think. It was well, for a time. Mosul was quiet until much later on, and it was being the sort of second most important city, it enabled them to do their work. But I don't think the actual project came to fruition in the end. I think bits of it probably did, but to have a whole street view of Iraq, cities in Iraq, was pretty tall order.
Yeah, I think we got a lot done, but obviously we was driving around places in Saddam City as it used to be called, where people had never seen a Westerner before. So it was good experience, but how we kind of come through it without anyone losing their life, I have no idea. So whenever that actually came to an end, I then went on to the Colonel. I don't know if you remember Colonel Enos that was on the. I was on his team for a further, I think, about a year before I kind of finished that. But yeah, I have good fond memories of Aegis, and I know that there is a group on Facebook with everyone that was kind of on or a lot of people that were on the Matrix, and they all speak highly of it. And I think that was the golden era of the kind of close protection market. Would you agree with that? Or
yeah, I mean, right place, right time, and able to deliver. And the Americans always say to me, we love Aegis because you do what it says on the tin. And of course, if you're working for an organization like the US government, you can afford to have all the bells and whistles. You can have all the equipment. You may remember our radios. They were probably better than the British Army radios. Easier to use, encrypted, whereas poor old soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan were struggling with Bowman and things like that, which didn't really work. But from the sort of commercial perspective, success perspective, it was the golden era, and I don't think you'll see the likes of it again. Although people keep asking me for advice and saying, "Well, what's going to happen with Ukraine?" Well, who knows now with the way things are going. But had there been a peace settlement, or there will be a peace settlement, had there been what people envisage as a peace settlement there, then the reconstruction of Ukraine would probably throw up another period of time where private security contractors could get a lot of work and make a lot of money. But since Iraq finished and Afghanistan finished, I think it's been quite tough in the private security sector. I mean, I'm out of it, but I keep my ear to the ground, and I think it's never going to be like that again.
No, absolutely. I know guys that are still doing it, but it's not on the scale it was. And I think that was the exciting part at the early days, because it was a really new thing. The money was good, the rotations were good. It was a new experience, and then like everything, kind of things changed. The standards tended to lower with a lot of companies towards the end. They started putting in mixed teams with local nationals. I have nothing against local nationals, but the standards aren't as high as the British Army, and things like that. So I think that's where it kind of people started. I jumped across to the anti-piracy, and you had a part with Trident, or was partnered in Trident. Was that before
That's really well. It was called. It was Trident was a subsidiary company to Aegis, and it was called Trident for obvious reasons, because it was to do with maritime stuff, and it was quite successful. But the piracy thing got bigger later, and we were already focused on land operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, Yemen. So we didn't really follow it up. And there were other people, specialist companies. I forget their names, some of them, but they've tended to specialize in that market. And it became quite a major thing, and has been recently with the events in the Red Sea.
Yeah, it was a good, again, I was lucky enough to work in that industry when it was a bit of a golden era. Again, money's kind of lowered, things have sort of changed, rotations got longer, which doesn't necessarily suit people that have families and stuff. Whereas the early days, you could do a month on, a month off in 2010 and around there. So no, really, really good times. So yeah, kind of moving on. I have a couple of questions for you. Obviously, when you finish sort of Aegis towards the end of what time did Aegis kind of finish, or did you step away from it?
We sold it,
right? Okay,
to a competitor. To be honest, I stepped backwards and handed over to another. I mean, as Iraq started to settle down, I handed over to somebody else who became the chief executive. I stepped back a bit, and then, to be honest, having had from 2004 to 2012, every 6 weeks, Iraq, Afghanistan. Because I would go out on the ground. The important thing was
I remember, yeah,
to meet people. And well, I took a view. It goes back to how we structured Aegis, and it was like a military unit, and the commanding officer has to be seen. It's got to be, people got to know who he is. Got to go and share a bit of the danger with the troops, and that was my way of doing business. But after a period of time, I thought, okay, and with my partners, we decided we'd had enough of the 3 o'clock in the morning phone call is never going to be good news. So, and that gets a bit wearing after a bit. So we decided to sell it, and sold it in 2015 to Garda World, a competitor company. It was only ever going to be bought by somebody else in the business, and they really wanted to buy our contracts. So we sold it.
Right, okay. I did hear rumblings that it got sold on, but I think I was out of it by then. I left in 2010, and it subsequently went on for a couple of years. But it kind of leads me on. I wanted to talk to you about, obviously, I do the podcast with the main goal of raising awareness for kind of mental health issues within the military, veterans communities, and emergency services in the current job I do now. But I wanted to talk about, because obviously you've been involved in all sorts of kind of campaigns and some of the worst places in the world throughout your career. I want to know kind of your opinions on the current mental health situation of veterans, and kind of if there's anything that you've kind of struggled with over the years. Because I spoke with Simon Mann, who's a good friend of yours, last week. I had him on the podcast, and he had some really, really good points about how he manages his mental health, and he's had parts throughout his life. So the same question to you really is like anything that's affected you over the years. Because again, if I can get people that have done what you've done just being a bit open about it, then I like to think it encourages everyday folk to just go, well, if he can talk about it, then so can I. So that was always kind of a part of it.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's a very, very complicated issue, this whole question of what used to be called battle shock, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think my view of it is I completely understand it, and it affects different people in different ways. You can have two people standing together in the same incident, same drama, same horrible circumstances, and one person is badly affected and the other person isn't. And there is, in my experience, there's no rhyme or reason why that happens. And quite often the people you expect not to be affected are the ones that are affected, and the ones that you perhaps thought might find it a little bit more demanding, not bothered at all. I have, I'm lucky in that I have always been involved in these theatres of operation. And whilst I've always tried to be in there with the lads, as it were, I've always been in a sort of command position. Certainly commanding my battalion in Belfast, I was out on patrol every day because I think that's the job of the commanding officer, and that was quite demanding. But I was lucky. We had a few incidents, none of which were I was directly involved in. So whilst there was the mental pressure of command and responsibility, there wasn't the day-to-day, whatever you want to call it, fear or apprehension of being involved in something really unpleasant. And I suspect that the worst example of this sort of thing is Afghanistan, more than Iraq, I think. And I've just finished reading a book about the entire British Army deployment in Afghanistan, and I must say I was quite horrified about some of the decisions made and some of the equipment deficiencies and the way that the campaign was prosecuted. But what struck me most was the incidents of not only physical trauma, but mental trauma as well, and people coming back and really finding it quite difficult to adapt from that sort of environment. So to answer your question, it hasn't really affected me. I haven't had any sort of symptoms. At least I think so. Other people might disagree. But
that's exactly what Simon said as well.
well, it's true. If you think you're coping, you probably are, but you may exhibit character traits to other people that you don't notice. So I think there's always the danger of that. There's always the danger of, oh, it didn't happen to me. But ask 10 of my friends, so you may get a completely different answer, or ask my wife or whatever. But it hasn't manifested itself in any particular way. But I'm lucky. As I said, I was sort of one step removed. I didn't go to Helmand, which I think was probably the most difficult place people have served with for probably since the Second World War. Whilst, I see it all around me. I'm in London most of the time. I see lots of homeless soldiers or servicemen, or people say they are. And I'm entirely sympathetic. But I think, as long as the system, whether it's the military or the National Health Service, recognize this, and you mentioned, I think, first responders and people like that. Ambulance and police and fire brigade who went, for example, to the Manchester Arena. I suspect that, or the London bombings. There was a very good program on television about the London bombings, and I think quite a lot of people in the first responder professions found it very difficult. Soldiers, I think, are sort of better prepared for it, because you really understand from day one when you sign up, it could happen to you. And the IED war in Afghanistan was particularly unpleasant. I mean, it's one thing to be in a contact where you're shooting back, but to be walking along every day, worried that your next footfall is going to blow your leg off is not very nice, and it will take its toll, both physically and mentally. So I'm totally supportive of this, and I recognise it. But luckily for me, not too bad.
Yeah, I say the same. I mean, I've done a bit, and not as much as others, but more than some. And I've been very, very lucky that kind of I've not had major struggles, but I have been linked, and I know loads of friends that have sadly taken their own life across the way, along the kind of the journey. So it's a bit like, if I could do my little bit to kind of raise awareness and get people talking to it, it can only be a good thing.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's so sad when people feel they have to take their own lives because they're not being looked after. I mean, it's all very well to say, well, get a grip of yourself. That doesn't work. If you're really going down that dark alleyway, you need people to recognize it and to surround you and be helpful.
No, awesome stuff. Well, thank you very much for your honesty, Tim. I've got one more question. Basically, we touched on it before. Well, two more questions really, really quickly. I know you're conscious of time. We talked about the whole kind of Starmer on about sending British troops. I was going to ask you that prior. It was one of my questions, whether you think that would be a perfect opportunity for another kind of private military sort of contract. And you've already kind of really touched on that it could happen.
It could happen. I mean, who knows what's going to happen? If we've been having this conversation a week ago, I'd have said, yeah, great. Trump's going to force a settlement. My vision of a settlement would be a demilitarized zone, not managed by the UN, because I don't think they'd be able to do it. With the best will in the world, some of the military standards of UN member countries are not perhaps up to NATO standard. So I would have envisaged a NATO buffer zone, peace enforcement zone rather than a peacekeeping zone, if governments are prepared to do that. And I would see a huge role for private contractors because, the British Army is not that big, and it's, pretty much the same in European countries. And if you think about deployed, training, rotation and leave, it's a huge bill. And therefore it could be a place for private contractors. But the way things are going, I wouldn't be holding my breath.
Well, I might have to dust off the chest rig and the kit, but no, I think I'm done with that kind of line of work. But and I just wanted to finish off by asking, kind of, what do you have anything that you can talk about that you're working on currently, or is it a lot of golf now, boss? Or
no, no, I'm not a golfer. No, I do a bit of hunting and shooting and things, but no, I'm really writing books. I've written 2 sort of biographical books about the Second World War, about special operations, and I'm working on a 3rd and a 4th. So that's really what I do. Well, I keep my hand in. I talk to Ukrainians, and I sort of keep my ear to the ground, as it were. But my day is rather like yours. The chest rig is firmly hanging up on the wall.
yeah, well, it could be dusted off. I'm not going to lie. I keep sort of hearing, I know a lot of people in the industry, and I keep thinking, well, maybe, but I've got that many injuries that I don't think I'll be able to kind of get myself up to the fitness standard, to be honest. But hey ho. But no, look, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Like I said, I'm conscious of the time, but thank you for making the time to come on. Thank you for sharing your views and stuff across the board. It's been a pleasure, and please take care.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.